Well, I'm excited for this guy being a full-on symphony from one of my favorite keyboardists of all time. Let's see how this one stacks up. 5 by Tony Banks. So at this point, Tony Banks really shouldn't need too much of an introduction from anybody that's been watching my videos. Tony Banks is the lead keyboardist and pianist for Genesis. He's also one of the main songwriters for the group, and he is unfortunately probably the least recognized out of all of the solo careers of all the Genesis bandmates. Like, you have such heavy hitters and pop icons such as Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins out of the group. You also have the very successful solo career that Stephen Hackett put out, and even the moderately successful one from Michael Rutherford with Mike and the Mechanics and even Mike Rutherford. But Tony Banks has unfortunately been overlooked within his own solo career, starting off with A Curious Feeling that came out in 1979. It was received lukewarm. It was just really hard to follow up. The Fugitive coming out in 1983, followed up with Bank Statement that came out in 1989. He did put out a few soundtracks like The Wicked Lady in 1983, but the 90s were definitely not a good time for Banks. He put out Still and Strictly Inc., which, again, the most he got was lukewarm reviews, and he decided in the 2000s to shift gears entirely. This is where he decided to kind of stop making contemporary, I guess, keyboard-led and synth-led rock and follow strictly into more of the classical contemporary music. And he put out 7, A Suite for Orchestra in 2004, as well as 6 pieces for orchestra in 2012. Unfortunately, like all of his other works, they were received lukewarm. Like, nobody really came out and said they were amazing. Most of the time people are like, it was music, but nobody really clapped their hands and stood up giving a full standing ovation for it. And so what do we have with 5? Well, it does follow suit with 7 and 6 being a full-on 5-track symphony, and this one was written and performed in conjunction with the Czech National Symphony Orchestra and Choir. I really hope this is the one that gives him the dues because, damn, it is good. Now, I will admit, I do love classical music, and I go out of my way to look for up-and-coming and new contemporary classical music. And I've noticed within the zeitgeist of the time, much like a lot of contemporary artists, classical music has found a very dark and a very pessimistic outlook. And I'm looking mainly at, like, Max Richter. A lot of it is very dark, sinister, broody. There's not a whole lot of celebratory music within the classical sphere, outside of maybe like the soundtrack works. But even within the soundtracks, the Zimmer drop has permeated that to such an extent that you can't hear anything else. A lot of the soundtracks and scores that we hear within today's contemporary movies are just kind of retreading the same ground. There's not a whole lot of originality. So when I came to 5, I was very pleasantly surprised to finally have a new sound and a new construction of music. And that's really what we find within 5. I was blown away. Each movement, because there are 5 pieces, which I call like the money shot. Like, this is the one where the camera just zooms in on that one piece and it just hits the mark perfectly. I'm surprised that each piece is able to do this. Like, having this happen once or twice on an album is rare, but having it hit every single track is just a treat. This guy came out in what, like February or something like that, and I've had to really take my time and really resist talking about this album because I wanted to make sure that I got it right. And I feel like now is the time to finally talk about it, now that it's had its chance to really dive into my own soul. As I said, each movement has its own real identity and its own moment. It really has its own personality as well. A lot of this is simple music, but done in a very complex way, or it's a very complex movement that's done in a very simplistic way. And I love that superimposure that you have on this. Like, either the forefront is complex and the background is very easy listening, or the background's very complex and the forefront is very easy listening, and that duality between there. Now, I'm not going to go song by song on here because it's really hard to talk about it song by song when it's really a complete piece. So I'm not going to do that within this particular review, but I am going to talk about the overall whole. The other thing that I really want to mention within this album is the the smart use of each individual instrument and when each one takes its role. We're talking about mainly the trumpet and the clarinet that's found within this. Like, those are the two main dominant forces found within this album outside of the piano and keyboards. And Banks knows exactly when to use the brass and the bombastic sound of the trumpet and when to use the more personal and more soothing sounds of the clarinet. I do need to talk about Revile, the second song. This is where he uses that trumpet very bombastically, and he almost overused the trumpet, and that might be one of my only criticisms, but the more I listened to it, the more I realized he's using the trumpet in a different way in each time, because that whole when he's using that within the trumpet, at first I thought he's overusing the trumpet. It maybe would have worked better with the clarinet, where the clarinet's more of that doo 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 instead of being that really bombastic sound. But I realized, no, he's using it in different ways, where one, it's very bombastic with the drums leading behind and that whole symphony coming behind it, and other times it's very intimate, where it's just that lone trumpet on the battlefield. And the other section within the clarinet, within Ebb and Flow, I love that use, and again, he knows when to use each one, because within Ebb and Flow, the third track, it's much more of a personal, and I do recognize that there is a note sequence that's essentially ripples from Trick of the Tail from Genesis, where it's that doo, 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 doo. Like, that note sequence is essentially the same as sail away, away. So it's that same note sequence but done in a different way. I thought, like, it did kind of draw me out a little bit, because I'm like, I see what you're doing there, but at the same time, it's presenting in a completely different environment, in a completely different way, that I let that pass. And talking about structure of this album, the structure of this album is done very beautifully. The opening track being almost the Goliath of the track, the prelude to A Million Years, being like 15.5 minutes. It really sets down the groundwork of what we're going to be expecting. And then the last track of Renaissance being that final closure, because the ending sequence of Autumn Sonata, which is a perfect name and title for this track, because it really feels like the autumn. Like, you can feel and see the leaves changing color, the atmosphere changing into, like, from summer to winter. Perfect saying for that one. But the ending of Autumn Sonata, you feel like, okay, we're ready for the ending. We're coming into the final sequence, which is Renaissance, and Renaissance being that perfect closure and that perfect way of closing out the album. So overall, this is one of those albums that I've really been taking my time with, and it feels very personal to me. I've held off reviewing this because I wanted to make sure that I was rating it the proper way, because I wanted to make sure that I was getting this right, and I feel confident enough to really plant my flag down into this field. I have to say, 5 by Tony Banks is an absolute masterpiece. And if you guys have been following me, you know I don't hand those out willy-nilly. I think I've only given that rating to 3 contemporary albums since I've started this, like 4 years ago. So this is a very special album. This is one that you have to listen to and really get into it. If you're a fan of purely instrumental classical pieces like I am, you're really going to love this, and you're going to find that it is a very special album. If you're not that big of a fan, you're still going to enjoy it. This is a perfect album to put on into the background and really find yourself enjoying the music. So that's about it. That's enough gushing for me for 5 by Tony Banks. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Have a spin and let me know of your own thoughts by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys, as always, are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.